Before I start this tutorial, I just want to quickly update you guys on my latest Skillshare class that I made of this honeybee. If you guys follow me on Instagram, you might remember that I painted a small honeybee a few months ago for a friend, and I created a poll asking if you guys would like to see this as a full Skillshare class, and I received a lot of response. More than 90% of you voted yes, so I finally made it. I made the position of the wings of this bee a bit different to the original one because I wanted to challenge myself and play with the translucent effect of the wings, but you can use the techniques that I have shown you in this class to create customized paintings as well, in case you want to make the opened honeybee wings instead. Just like my YouTube tutorials, I will take you through the sketch as well as the painting process step by step until completion, but the pace of my classes are slower and it's also divided into shorter lessons, so the information is a bit easier to digest in my opinion. And if you guys are interested, please drop by on Skillshare to give this class a go. If you've never been a member on Skillshare though, you can also go to the link in my description box for a free membership trial for all of the classes available on this platform. Hope to see you there. Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to be painting a flower storefront. I noticed that a lot of you seem to enjoy storefront paintings, and since it's spring, I decided to do a florist storefront. I'm going to begin by drawing out a simple rectangle. I just want to make sure I shape it according to the frame of my paper. So I want to make sure I get the correct size more or less, and I also want to make sure that it's in the middle. I want the name sign to be at the top, so here I'm just sectioning that out. I want the design of the storefront itself to be quite simple since I want to pay more attention for the flowers surrounding the storefront. So on the right hand side, I made a small section for the window, and on the left, I am going to section out space for a large window. Here I'm just trying to figure out the height, and I'm not sure if you noticed, but I tried to double up the lines so there's a bit of space in between for extra wall and space for door frames and window frames and things like that. Once I'm happy with how I've divided up the rectangle, this is where I start adding on the designs for the door. And I'm also going to add ornamental elements like railings around the pillars, under and above the signage and things like that. So the design doesn't look too flat, I also added a step going into the entrance and also a doormat. You can leave the window plain as is if you want, but I just want to draw some frames, so here I'm just dividing it up into 9 squares. As for the name, I'm going to call mine Morning Bloom because it just happened to pop into my head, but it's completely up to you. You can also leave the sign empty if you want to. So that's pretty much it for the design of the storefront. Next, I'm just going to try to frame this storefront with plants and pots of flowers. As you can see, I'm still sketching really lightly. If anything, I try to simplify the plants even more, so I'm only drawing out either the silhouettes of the whole plant or just the crates, boxes, and pots. I want to include a lot of flowers, so on the left of the storefront, I'm going to draw out a bench with a lot of small pots. I'm going to vary the size of the pots, but it will also look fine if you make the pots look exactly the same. In front of the bench, I'm going to draw out buckets or big cans, which are basically the same size and shape, where I'm going to display more flowers. As you can see, I'm not spending too much time drawing the flowers or the plants themselves. I just want to make sure I get the spacing correctly by placing the pots and buckets first. I'm going to try to fill the page, so I'm going to paint more pots in front of the buckets, and here I'm placing them in small crates, and I'm going to draw out more small pots within the crates. By the way, I realized that this is a lot of things to draw, so I will have the outline available in my coffee shop. And that's all the outline I'm going to do for the composition. I'm also going to finish this up by drawing out the silhouette of the bush of flowers on top of the building. Next, I'm going to go over the colors I'll be using. This is Rose of Ultramarine by Daniel Smith, Quin Red by Daniel Smith, Vermilion by Holbein, Jaune Brilliant by Holbein, Hansa Yellow Medium by Daniel Smith, Terre Verte by Holbein, Aquarius Green by Roman Szmal, Cerulean Blue by Holbein, Sepia by Holbein, Quin Sienna by Daniel Smith, Buff Titanium by Daniel Smith, Chinese White by Holbein, Graphite Grey by Daniel Smith, and Blueproof White by Dr. P.H. Martins. I'm going to start out by painting the bush of flowers on top of the building. I want to begin by using a peachy pink color from a mix of Chinese White, Quin Red, and a little bit of Jaune Brilliant. I'm going to paint roses as the main flowers of this bush. So here I'm creating small individual curved lines going radially and getting a bit larger as I get towards the outer petals. Then while the surface is still wet, I use a thicker consistency of Quin Red to paint the center, and I'm just going to let the color bloom or spread out naturally. As you can see, I'm doing a few at a time, so I make sure that the surface doesn't dry out yet, but it's also not overly wet, so the center won't spread out too fast and too much. Next, I'm going to use the same mixture, but with more Chinese White and Jaune Brilliant in the mix, so it's a bit more peachier than the first one. This time, I'm going to paint smaller version of the roses, and I'm also not going to bother with the center at this point. Then I'm going to create a peachier version and a lighter version of this color to paint some loose cascading flowers and some light feathery plants with a thinner consistency of the same color to suggest some pampas grass. Next, I'm going to create a light purple color from a mix of Rose of Ultramarine with Chinese White. Then I'm going to use this color to paint some lavender looking things. I know it's not really visible at the moment, but I just basically painted dots on either side going inwards, forming a short line. I also used this color to paint more cascading flowers, and just like before, I painted them as dots. After that, I use a thick consistency of Hansa Yellow Medium to create similar textures as the flowers that I've painted earlier. It all looks very abstract for now, but once we add the green, it will slowly come together. Next is the blue hue. I use Cerulean Blue with Chinese White again. I want the color of the flowers to look very pastel-y. And again, I just created random textures with the blue. So here, once I've scattered enough colors around, I'm going to begin painting on the green. I use a mix of Hansa Yellow Medium with Aquarius Green, and I'm applying this color by dotting around and painting around each individual flowers. I'm painting a section at a time, and as I move towards the next section, I like to vary the tone of the green slightly, so some of the green might have more Aquarius Green, and the one that I'm painting here has more Hansa Yellow Medium in the mix. This way it doesn't look too flat, and it creates a bit more interest to the painting. Overall though, for the base color of the greeneries, I do want a brighter yellow-green, but you can still vary the tone. I like to paint the base color per section. This way I have time to paint on top of the damp surface. And while the surface is still damp, I use a darker version of green. You can either use a thicker consistency of Aquarius Green, or you can also mix a bit of that Graphite Grey into the Aquarius Green. I like to place this darker green tone underneath the flowers. This will bring the flowers forward due to the contrast of the lighter colors of the flower petals and the dark green. Notice that as I'm painting this, I'm still leaving out some white negative space here and there to make it look a bit more loose and less dense. And as I get towards the edges of the greeneries, I tend to space the texture of the dots a little bit further apart. I felt here like the flowers are looking very light and it needs a little bit of a stronger color. So I use a thick consistency of vermilion to just dot certain areas. And I also use a mix of vermilion with Hansa Yellow Medium to redefine some of those pampas textured plants. I also felt like I needed more texture at the top of the flowers, so I used a thick consistency of Aquarius green to paint thin lines as stems. Then I painted more flowers on top of those stems using this peachy pink color, still in a loose and abstract way, and also some loose leaves here and there to complement the flowers. I'm quite happy with the flowers at the top now, so I'm going to move on to paint the round tree in front of the storefront. I used a mix of Aquarius green with a lot of Hansa Yellow as the base color, and I scatter very short curved lines to form sort of like a ball. And while the surface is still wet, I also do the same thing with a darker version of Aquarius green with a bit of cerulean blue. I want to use a thicker consistency of the darker value, especially towards the bottom left section of this ball of tree, and I try to scatter them a bit more as it comes towards the center. This way it'll add a little bit more three-dimensionality. Next, I'm going to paint the hanging flowers. As you can see, I've mixed two colors on my palette, a light pastel blue and also a pastel purple. For the pastel blue, I used a mix of cerulean blue with white. As for the purple, I used cerulean blue, Quin Red with white. I started out by painting the blue flowers in a medium to thin consistency, and I just scatter them around in the area that I've allocated from the sketch. I tried to create flower shapes as well as smaller dots around just to vary the growth stages, and while the surface of the flowers are still wet, I like to tap in a little bit of that purple mix for some of the flowers, so some flowers might still be blue and some flowers have a bit of purple. After I paint on these flowers, I then add the greeneries, just like how I did with the greeneries that I've painted so far. So with the light yellow green and then with a darker green to place on the right hand side as well as parts of the bottom of the flowers. It's much easier to do this if your flowers are completely dry. So if yours isn't dry yet, you can use a hair dryer to make the drying process quicker. This way the color of the flowers won't blend into the green. You can also make the flowers cascade downwards if you want, but I like mine to be balls of flowers. And after I finish painting all three of them, I like to make the edges a little bit more natural looking. So just like the flowers on top of the storefront, I like to add some loose flowers on the edges. I started out by painting really thin curved lines as stems, and then I paint individual flowers on top of those stems. This can be placed all around the clump of flowers, so some might be sticking upwards, sideways, or downwards. Here I felt like the darker green kind of blended too much into the yellow green, so I want to increase the contrast again by using a mix of Aquarius green and Graphite Grey. Moving on to the next flowers, here I'm using a mix of Terre, Verte, cerulean blue and white to create a blue-green pastel color. And here I'm going to paint on the small pots. To paint these ones, I create very small thin brush strokes that I pull downwards so each individual flower petals come together at the bottom. I also pair this up with some dots for a bit of size variation. After I paint on those flowers, I continue it downwards with the dark green mixture from earlier. While painting the stems, I try to not touch the flowers if they're still a bit damp so I don't risk contaminating the blues. Once I'm done, I use a pink mix to paint between the blue flower pots from a mix of the purple from earlier with added Quin Red and white. For this one, I want the greeneries to be bushy, so I use the same yellow-green mix from earlier. And then I follow it up with a darker green to paint underneath the flowers. Let's move on to the next flower. I'm going to paint tulips with an orange mix from Vermilion and Hansa Yellow. Here I made a U shape and then I tried to fill it in with lines in between. I'm then going to leave that to dry while painting simplified roses with Hansa Yellow Medium in a medium to thick consistency by just twirling my brush around, leaving a bit of negative space and just creating a circle. Then I'm going to paint more tulips on the right hand side using the same purple mix from earlier. Then for the last bucket, I painted more roses using a mix of Quin Red, a little bit of Jaune Brilliant, and white. So these flowers should still be a little bit damp, and while it's damp, I'm going to continue downwards painting on the sepals using Aquarius green. Then I follow it downwards to paint the stems with a straight line. I'm also going to do the same for the roses, but I'm not going to paint the sepals, just lines for the stems. Next, I'm going to paint long leaves for the tulips. I used Terre Verte. And as for the application, I tried to vary the pressure of my brush by using the tip of my brush and then pushing a little bit downwards and then taking off the pressure as I get towards the tip, so the tip is a little bit thinner than the rest of the leaves. For the pink roses, I ended up using a bit of Rose of Ultramarine to just dot the middle, and then I'm going to finish it off the same way as how I painted the other flowers. So that's basically how I paint most of the flowers. Here I'm just going to move on to fill more of the smaller pots. I used the same light blue mix and I just rolled my brush around to create sort of like a circle. I like to paint in between the pots, so I leave a bit of space if I want to vary the color. While the surface of the blue is still wet, I use cerulean blue by itself to just dot the center. Then while waiting for that to dry, I moved on to other flower pots. The ones on the right have smaller flowers, so for those I just used dots instead of circles instead. The small blue roses should be dry by now, so now I'm going to paint on pink roses in between those blue roses. On top of the blue roses, I also used a really light purple mix to just paint more roses to look like they're behind the blue roses. Then once I'm done, I'm going to paint the greens using a mix of Aquarius green and Hansa Yellow with a bit of Terre Verte. Then use a darker version of that color to paint some of the loose stems at the back as well as the shadows underneath the flowers. Since some of these flowers are green on this side of the rack, I decided to use dark green instead of the light yellow green to paint around the flowers. Once I'm done, I'm going to use the same mix in a thicker consistency just to paint the bottom to make the edges of the pots a bit cleaner. I'm also going to apply the same dark green mix for the larger buckets as well. For the flowers on the crate, I'm just going to basically paint more tulips, but in a larger size. I'm going to try to vary the colors, so the first one has the same colors as the hanging plants. The second one is a mix of Terre Verte, yellow, and white. Then I follow it up with more Terre Verte at the bottom while the surface is still wet. This orange one is from Hansa Yellow and Vermilion. Pink is from Quin Red, Jaune Brilliant, and white. And I also felt like I needed a darker value for a bit of contrast in color. I used a medium to thick consistency of ultramarine. Then for this purple one, I used a bit more cerulean blue in the mix. Since I painted the flowers quickly, the surface should still be wet, so here I continued with the sepals using Aquarius green and a medium to thick consistency. Then I follow it up by painting on the stems. And I'm just going to paint the leaves the same way as I did with the flowers on the bucket by using Terre Verte with maybe a little bit of Hansa Yellow if you would like to vary the color a bit more. Once I filled the rest of the space with the leaf green color, then I use a mix of Aquarius green with Graphite Grey to paint the bottom for a bit of shadows. And since the light blue tulips turned out a little bit too flat, I ended up lining some of the edges using the purple mix. For these smaller flower pots, I filled it with orange flowers from yellow and vermilion. Then I used Aquarius green to paint on some stems around the edges and fill in the rest of the greeneries around the flowers. Okay, so that's all of the flowers done. Next, I'm going to paint the trees. For the small one on the left, I just used whatever green I had left on my palette to paint the individual leaves. I tried to just vary the angle slightly, and I'm also going to do the same thing for the tree on the right hand side, but I used more Hansa Yellow in the mix. Then I also vary the color by using Terre Verte. I want to make sure everything's completely dry first because I filled up a lot of the space. After that, I use the thick consistency of Aquarius green to paint darker leaves behind the lighter ones that I've already painted. Next, I'm going to paint the stems on the trees. I use a mix of Quin Sienna with Sepia in a medium to thick consistency. For this round one, I tried to make the stems quite clean and straight. As for the other trees, I made the stems and branches a little bit thinner. To add a bit of color to this tree, I just use a thick consistency of vermilion. So next I want to paint the pots. I used a mix of Quin Sienna, Sepia, and Vermilion to create this terracotta color. I like to paint in between the pots here. And between those pots, I use the same mixture but with more sepia in the ratio to create a darker brown. As you can see, I'm leaving out a little bit of negative space just so everything doesn't look too bulky. Then next I'm going to paint on the buckets. I want to make this metal buckets, so I use a mix of graphite gray and Chinese white. While the surface is still wet, I want to follow up with a darker gray color with more graphite gray in the mix to paint the sides. This will make the buckets look more rounded. Next, I'm going to paint the crates. I used the same brown mix as the pots, but I added Hansa Yellow to vary the brown. And for the crate on the right, I still use the same mix with added sepia, and I use a medium to thin consistency. For these pots, I added Hansa Yellow and Vermilion into the mix, so it's a bit more orangey. I made sure to paint in between the pots since the crate is showing through, and while the surface is still damp, I also added straight lines for the texture of the crate, and I also added a darker version of the pot color for a little bit of interest to the painting. Then for the rest of the tiny pots, I just used the same mixture. For the larger pot on the left, I just use Quin Sienna as is, and for the smaller one, I just use sepia. Now that you've seen how I mix my colors though, you can create different variations of browns for your own painting, so you don't have to make the exact same color mixtures. The next thing I'm going to paint are the flowers behind the window. And for this, I basically used the exact same colors that I've already used for the previous colors, but I used a thinner consistency version of the colors so the detail of the window doesn't take away from the flowers that we painted in front of the storefront. I also painted the flowers larger so it's a bit easier to fill in the space. Here, I basically tried to fill in the space with different types of plants that I could think of at that time. Then I want to blur everything together using a gray-green mix from the green that I already have on my palette with added sepia and graphite gray. Then I use a very thin consistency of this color to paint the background, while parts of the flowers and plants that I painted earlier are still a little bit damp, so the edges of the flowers and background kind of blur out together. I also decided to add shelves where there's space at the back with some pots, but because the surface is still wet, these features are just going to be very blurry and it will have a bit of an abstract look, but that's what I look for this section of the painting. If not, everything will just end up looking very cluttered and messy. Now that I'm done with the flowers, I'm going to move on to the actual storefront. I started out by outlining the signage using my pen. I also vary the weight of the lettering just so it doesn't look too plain. And after that, I'm going to outline the rest of the building with this pen as well. For some sections of the building where there's a bit of space for lines, I like to double them up for a bit more ornamental detail, especially around things that would frame certain areas like the windows or on top and below the signage. I feel like this would give me a bit more space to play around with the form to paint more shadows later on. And here I tried to add a bit of texture to the mat with the way I outlined that area. I forgot about the windows on the doors, so I'm just going to make something up using the exact same technique as how I painted the display window. Near the top of the windows, I tried to just glaze a bit of the green that I already had on my palette in a medium to thin consistency, and this will just blur out the window a little bit more to separate it from the hanging plants. For the welcome mat, I use a medium consistency of the yellow brown again and a darker value for the side. For the single step, I use a mix of graphite gray with white to create this concrete looking texture. As for the rest of the building, I want the building to have two tones, which is pink and also a creamy color. The pink here is from Quin Sienna, Jaune Brilliant, White, and Buff Titanium to make the pink a bit more consistent with the creamy color of the building. Once I'm done with the base color, I use a darker value of the exact same mixture. You can also play around with just the consistency. So I added a bit of shadow at the top of the signage. And as for the darker value of Buff Titanium, I used the browns that I already have on my palette mixed with a lot of Buff Titanium. As you can see, I painted the pink on top of the creamy areas of the building because I felt like it needed a bit more color. But once I'm happy with the whole base color, this is where I start adding the shadows, especially near the rims and the frames of the building. For the shadow of the pink, you can also use the Buff Titanium and brown mix and just glaze it on top of the pink if you want. Since watercolor is transparent anyway, the dark brown will just look like it's mixed with the base color of the pink. Don't forget to also paint behind the pots that you've already painted so it doesn't look white behind the pots. You can use any dark tone, but I just use a thick to medium consistency of sepia. Once I'm done filling behind the pots, I'm going to use the exact same color in a thinner consistency to paint the cast shadows behind the pots of plants that I've already painted, under the hanging plants, and so on. For the shadow on these buckets though, I use graphite gray instead of sepia. Then I use a clean damp brush to soften the edges. For the first layer of the rest of the cast shadow on the ground, I just use graphite gray in a medium to thin consistency, and I soften the edges using a clean damp brush. I also use graphite gray to paint behind the mat. Here I'm going to build the texture of the mat as well by using the brown that I already have on my palette and just dotting it around to make a fluffier texture. Then I went over the writing welcome using a thick consistency of graphite gray once everything is completely dry. I'm going to go back to the cast shadows again once the first layer is dry. I use a mix of graphite gray with a bit of sepia, and I use a medium to thick consistency to paint right at the bottom of all the objects, and then I again soften the blend using a clean damp brush. Next, I want to paint the remaining cast shadows right under the flowers on the pots using a mix of sepia and Quin Sienna, but for the darker pots at the back, I would add more sepia into the mixture to create something darker. Then I added Aquarius green into the sepia mixture and used this dark green to paint shadows at the bottom area of the greeneries. At the top of the storefront, I'm also going to add darker colors underneath the flowers as well to make them pop out more. I also added a thinner consistency of the same mix to paint the cast shadows of the cascading plants and to also increase the contrast of the cast shadow on the hanging plants. You can leave this as is, but as I sketched it out before, I want to also paint on the frame of the window. So here I use a medium to thick consistency of bleed proof white to paint on the frames as how I sketched it out before. And I also did the same for the windows on the door just to keep it consistent in terms of the design. I use a medium to thick consistency of bleed proof white to paint this on, and after that I'm going to outline it so it's painted in the same style as the rest of the building. And that's pretty much it for this painting. You can do some more final adjustments if you want. This is definitely one of those paintings which took longer than anticipated, but I hope you guys enjoyed this one as much as you guys enjoyed my previous storefront paintings. Like usual, all the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in my description box. I'll also have the outline available in my coffee shop. If you guys are still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!